other day that went for an hour, and I had an hour of people that had questions at a school that didn't know, at Staten Island Community College, where there wasn't a human being in the room that knew who Bella Abzug was, Betty Friedan was, didn't know about Beijing, but they were coming because their professors at the school wanted to bring the Beijing platform, and the professors didn't know who Bella Abzug and all these people are. So one is, I just want to say,
we didn't in the Netherlands,
right?
Either. We didn't know. Also.
No, I'm just saying. So we are. There were maybe 100 people or more in the room. The point of what I'm saying is that we're at a process. You've now said we started out in Mexico, so it's very interesting that Mexico's in the room. Because Mexico City 1975 was the first global conference of women, right? And I'm not going to do that speech now that says what happened in Mexico, what happened in Copenhagen, because these are very important things to know, but we should talk about it this week, because you're going to hear a lot. What happened in Nairobi, because Nairobi was a watershed conference. That's when the third world got involved in the conferences. And then there was Beijing. And so the simple thing to remind you that Beijing, that you need to know, is that the women's movement, how many people are involved in the Beijing process, Sunita?
Process?
The process to Beijing. The old Beijing, not this Beijing. You weren't old enough to do that. So the point is, it's important to understand that going to Beijing was a turning point of the women's movement. That when most of the feminist movement, because remember there are three themes: equality, development, and peace. The equality people, who are the feminists looking for equal rights, right, who had been on all the conferences, and who made it happen. So one is, you should know, no UN would have done anything regarding women if the women of the world hadn't started marching and protesting in the late 60s, early 70s. That's why they did it. Do you think the UN does this stuff because they like you, like women? So the whole conference started because of external activism. So it's really important to know. By the time we get, at each conference, and all I'm saying is that the point you need to know is that each global conference, and those of you there, got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the women's movement did a lot of analysis and began to heal the rift between the North and the South, the East and the West, between the peace people that were only looking at war and not looking at violence against women, the development people that didn't want to think about women's empowerment and gender because they said we don't need to deal with women, and the equal rights women that kept thinking they had the only thought in town. So the people that thought they had the only thought in town from Europe and North America had to change and begin to hear on development. And everybody moved, so that going into Beijing, all of a sudden people became very clear, we have to look at the documents, right? We didn't care, I don't know about you, I did not care if when I was in Mexico City, and I was at all, Mexico City, Copenhagen, Nairobi, I went there to meet other women. Because what were we doing? We were building networks. So Groot started in Nairobi in 1985, right? 1985, because what did we say? There are no grassroots women here. There were no grassroots women in Mexico. There were no grassroots women in Copenhagen except one who was the wife of a Bolivian miner that had been killed. One. And people were impressed that she was a great speaker. I said, it's great. I got 1 million women that could speak like her, right? By the time we got to Nairobi, and you'd think we're in Africa, we're going to see grassroots women. We did. They were Maasai women selling jewelry. And that's why groups formed. So out of anger that the women's movement, and I come from the women's movement, out of the anger that the women's movement was not seeing grassroots women as people that could be in global conferences, right, and speak for themselves and have their own analysis, Groups was formed, and that's where Lana comes in. So by the time, and we had to figure out how to do this. So I'm saying is that when we got to Beijing, we were now up the gun. We had moaned for a long time about where the grassroots women, and we put together the grassroots tent in Huairou, China. But we had to get them there. because it's easy to complain. And now how are we going to get them there? So we ran a 50-50 campaign to bring professional women, grassroots women. That movie you can all look on neighborhoodwomen.org, and you should look at it because it's very powerful. The only time in the history of the global conferences that there was a space dedicated to grassroots women. There always, when Sunita says she organized grassroots, a lot of people organized grassroots. I'm not saying that nobody did. There was no autonomous space for grassroots women to control and have. So that tent was a very important thing. While we were doing the tent, the rest of the women's movement was starting to look at the Beijing the platform for action, because they had now learned that if you don't have it in the document, nobody's going to fund it, right? Governments, donors, everybody else, they look in there and they say, oh yeah, it's in the Beijing platform. They did. And so people began to wordsmith and write in there, and the women's movement got very good at it. And discipline, and this goes back to Jamaica, if you don't stick together, the only way the women's movement got their points in is they sat down at every meeting in a caucus every day, and they built their ideas into the government documents, and they showed where in the document, right? Where in the document is I want to put my point of view. Because no government, and you're going to be with governments all week, no government wants to hear you come up about your many issues if you don't show them how they can use it. They'll just be very nice because they don't have time. So this was a radical thing. This document came out of the women's, and I'm talking about the feminist movement growing up. Because the grassroots, we weren't looking at this document, though we did have a grassroots caucus, and we got a couple things in this thing. But we were focused on grassroots women organizing and networking and having a space in the world. So do you understand? It's very important to get that historical thing, because this is historic. Why is this conference this way? And if I was doing my organizing thing, I was in the room with Charlotte Bunch and all the people that sat and said, we don't want to open up this document, right? Why does because if you make one change in here, say I want to add HIV and AIDS, or I want to add climate change, right? She will tell you. Then the right wing and the conservatives can change everything here. So the women's movement leaders, because California wanted to host the real conference, the women's movement leaders made a decision, not with my assent, believe me, to have a conference that was celebratory, that would look at what have women done from Beijing till now, and how do we go forward. But the real meat of governments having a document to really look at, do you understand, to open up and look at, was gone. And people knew, and I want to just say people knew what they were trading off. Because Beijing, with 30,000 women going to Beijing or more, 42,000, because she'd no more, 42,000 went there. China put us out in Wairo, and that's why we have the name, because it's symbolic. China did not want the women's movement in Beijing. They put them an hour away in Wairo and built the whole community. So women had to take a bus back and forth to get to the government meeting to lobby the government. So I'm saying is that Wairo is a symbolic name, is where are women placed. For us, it was where the grassroots tent was, and it was our link to Habitat, because Habitat came and created the Wairo Commission. But I don't want to go into that side. I'll just say, so that the women's movement traded off not to open up the document, which means that your declaration that people are talking about, and Lana will talk about it, is all there is. And this is a real problem for the women's movement. They were unwilling to fight it out, and they felt this is the feminist movement. This is why the grassroots are now needed. I want to say to you, the feminist movement was feeling that vulnerable globally that they could not win in many of the places. And I suggest that a lot of it's because they are not organized on the ground. And that the people that have the political power, Maxentia, right? We have political power, feminists have political power. But if you're not grounded in a community where you have elected political officials, where you vote right? And you're only at the national level and you're not grounded and you're not going to win. So I'm saying is that that's why this conference is celebrating. They're trying to make it smoke and mirrors. They're trying to make it look a certain way. UN Women was a strategy, as you know. We traded in UNIFEM for UN Women, you know, and all of these structures in place. On the other hand, the end of my statement, because she's looking at my time, because there really is important things to discuss here. We can't do it in the time, but I would like to suggest that in reality, if we hadn't done these 4 conferences, when I look at the world right now, and I think that because of Mexico, Copenhagen, Nairobi, Beijing, and now, we have built globally a political apparatus for women, weak or strong, but there is. Everybody has a committee on the status of women. Everybody has these gender units. Everybody's looking at planning. We have now UN Women, and I don't know if I'm wrong, but I saw that they had 160 million in their budget and 120 million in the trust fund. And I think it's important. That was what people wanted to get from is resources. So almost how many women's organizations have funds and do run programs and people get paid? We built the structure that in 1975 had almost no funded women's programs in the world. We were all volunteers. Now we have millions and millions of dollars that are flowing to people to run and do things. That's a pretty big thing. And if we didn't have the UN there giving validity, on one hand, the UN does give validity to women's empowerment in a way that feminist activists, us, maybe can't do. So you're going to go into a week where we need to have, what are we really trying to say in our caucuses? Because you're going into a place where probably the most political place will be the regional caucuses, right? Yeah. There's regional caucuses. There has to be some discussions on where are we going from here. Because what is the vision now? Because women